Thank you so much. First off, I want to say welcome. Again, thank you all very much for attending. It's not often that you find or hear the discussion about the economic case for investing in young children, but I think today it's going to be a very, very interesting and perhaps even a very eye-opening discussion and conversation about how important this is for all of us here in Portage County. I want to step back just a little bit, though, and talk about a few things before we get into the main presentation. And in particular, we stepped back into 2012 when a life report for Portage County was completed that brought out some very interesting information, especially as it relates to the children and the young folks here in our community. In particular, when you look at what the reading proficiency scores are for kids in Portage County, is you see a huge difference in what those scores are and what that proficiency is when you look at folks that are economically disadvantaged. And in particular, when you look at the specifics from that standpoint, the kids that are in that economically disadvantaged category are about half of what the other students are. And reading proficiency is such an important aspect and so important, it really then identified something that I think was needed very much so here in Portage County. And from that is what spurred the Born Learning Initiative. Now, when you look at it from the standpoint, this is much more than just another program. This is a true initiative that's focused on a system change for our community. And the most important part of it, when you look at it, is that it's a tremendous partnership between both the community aspects and the public institutions, but also from a private institution for various businesses and so on within the community. When you look at this, what it really boils down to for our particular vision, what our focus is to focus on the safe, the health, and the readiness of kindergarten for students moving into kindergarten. And it's pretty simple, but that's the reason it is, because it really focuses on what's our ultimate goal. Now, when we look at that, how are we going to really make this as an impact, and how is this impact going to work out on the community? Most importantly, one, it's going to look at from the perspective of improving child health, but also really driving that optimal child development area. With that, ensuring all children are safe and cared for, and most importantly as well with that is strengthen families. Now, to do this, again, as I talked about, this is not just something simple. This is a much broader scale and a broader scope, and you'll learn more and more about this as the Born Learning Initiative continues to be communicated and talked about in the community. And the part that we look at it from the standpoint is it really looks at a complete cross-section coordination of all the different institutions and different organizations that are involved. And to make this effective, what we really looked at it from the perspective of is to really devise a social service triage system to identify those children that are in the greatest need. Based on a group of folks that drove from the steering committee perspective, is they come up with a model that uses a family screening tool to really identify and help locate those individuals of greatest need. But the one thing with this initiative that's so unique and so different than everything else that we've come across is the fact that it took all of those core services, those ones that are the most critical areas, as gateway partners, and it's brought them all into one single data silo. And that's really a major accomplishment because it's something that really hasn't been done effectively in the past. On top of that, what we've moved forward with is to not just take that information to help identify those folks that are in the greatest need, but it takes that information as well and brings it together. And in collaboration with Skyward, we've got a solution that's going to be able to provide key reporting and data management aspects, and ultimately the analytical information to take that to continually monitor the growth and the success of the kids in this program, and with that, really provide a way to do data-driven decisions that are going to be the greatest impact to making sure that this initiative is effective. But Skyward is not the only business that's involved with it. The great part with this is that it's got a tremendous support across the entire community. We've got businesses, we've got institutions such as various medical services areas, we've got public institutions, along with that, all the area school districts as well that brings this all together. And that's, again, I think one of the things that really stands apart, most importantly, about why this initiative is so important, but well with it, why it's going to be so effective. Now, the question is, you're probably wondering, what is it that I'm asking or what is it that we're asking of you? And initially here, really, it's relatively simple. We've got a few basic call to actions that following this is what we're asking and hoping that you will move forward with. Certainly, if you're on social media, you can go through Facebook. Just go ahead and follow the United Way page here of Portage County, where we will continually be putting out more and more information about what's happening with Born Learning. On top of that, we are wide open that if you would like us to come in and speak to your organization, whether it's a community or civic group or your business or within the schools themselves, we're happy to come in and talk about this program and the impact it's going to have. Along with that, I encourage you to definitely talk with your friends, your neighbors, and coworkers, and talk more and get the information out about what Born Learning entails and what the value it means and how it's going to have an impact on this community. And lastly, for getting more detailed information, please visit the United Way of Portage County's website. We've got a mailing list there. Again, we'll have a lot of information that will come out so you can keep yourself up to speed on what's happening. So let's get into the main portion of this presentation and really the biggest impact, which is the economic factors of this. I'm very pleased to announce Rob Grunewald, who is an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Rob has conducted research on community development and regional economic issues and co-authored Early Childhood Development, the Economic Development with a High Public Return. Since then, he's written several subsequent articles on economic and social impact of early learning. He frequently speaks to community and business leaders, policymakers, and media throughout the United States. Grunewald has served on boards and advisory committees for organizations involved with early childhood development, including Think Small, Leaders in Early Learning, First Children's Finance, and the Minnesota Visiting Nurse Agency. He is also a past president of the Minnesota Economic Association. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and religion from St. Olaf's College and a master's degree in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Rob Grunewald.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to add to the bio a little bit. I'm also a graduate of Watertown High School. And spend time in Madison, and also my grandmother lives up in Siren, Wisconsin, so I get to see Wisconsin quite a bit. So it's great to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is the economic case for investing in young children. I'm going to begin a bit by talking about the Federal Reserve. We'll look at some research in early childhoods, the economic case for investing, and then talk about some of the ways of investing from that research. So starting out, this is our Federal Reserve System map. There's 12 reserve banks. Stevens Point is in the 7th district with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago as the head office. I'm in the 9th district up in Minneapolis. And each of the reserve banks have functions that are similar across them all. We support making sure that there's cash in the economy. If banks need cash, we provide them that cash. We also regulate the overall flow of cash and money and credit in the economy in such a way as to keep prices stable and also to maximize employment. The Fed is one of the bank regulators in the economy and oversees the entire system of payments and also provides services for the federal government. That is, the Federal Reserve is the bank for the federal government. Each of these reserve banks have research departments. They look at issues around economic growth, advise the bank presidents in each of their banks who join the Board of Governors about every 6 or 7 weeks to determine what monetary policy is, and that's that flow of money and credit in the economy. And I come from a smaller function in the Federal Reserve. It's called the Community Development Section. This was part of our Federal Reserve mission that began really in the late 1970s after the pass of the Community Reinvestment Act, which makes sure that financial institutions are meeting the needs, the credit needs, deposit needs of all communities, particularly those in low to moderate income areas. And the Federal Reserve in each of our banks have some expertise in connecting banks and financial institutions to projects that would qualify for the CRA. And also we look at a variety of development issues around housing, built environment, transportation, public health issues, and also workforce and workforce quality. And that's where I've been spending a lot of my time at the bank, is asking this question: how do we make key investments to make sure we have a high quality workforce going forward? I'm going to make a plug here for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. One of the projects in the Federal Reserve is Healthy Communities. Here in these projects, we look cross-sector, bringing together professionals in public health with those that work in financing community development projects. And so on December 7th in Wisconsin Rapids, the Chicago Fed will be hosting a meeting there and encourages you to look into it and consider making the trip down to Wisconsin Rapids and taking in that conference. You're welcome to talk to me afterwards about it. So I'm going to start the discussion around research in early childhood with evidence from neuroscience and developmental psychology. And we start with a picture like this one. During the first year of life, there's tremendous growth in a child's brain. The parts of the brain that regulate sensory pathways are peaking in their development. The parts of the brain that are regulating language are also peaking. During the first couple years, those areas that regulate higher cognitive function are peaking in their development. So we also can look at a picture like this one, where we see that there are few connections, certainly, relatively fewer connections are made prior to birth, but certainly they are being made prenatal. And after birth, during those first couple years, there's this proliferation of connections. In a given second, somewhere between 700 up to 2,000 connections are being formed in a child's brain. So, and then after the first 3 or 4 years, the brain starts to become efficient. That is, those connections that were made early on and reinforced early on will stay, and those that are not reinforced early on will prune away, and they will leave. The brain will set itself relative to the environment that the child is growing up in. So if a child is hearing lots of vocabulary words in the home, in the community, have positive relationships and bonding with parents and caregivers, the opportunity to socialize with other children and explore his or her environment, that these are the type of conditions that create a healthy brain. And when that child arrives at school, is likely to be on a trajectory toward success. But if a child is subject to excessive adversity early on, what neuroscientists call toxic stress, such as growing up in poverty, just the stresses that come along with growing up in poverty, exposure to abuse or neglect, or also violence in the home or in the community, also household dysfunction, such as a parent who is incarcerated or is suffering from mental health issues or chemical abuse. These are the type of risk factors that developmental psychologists will point to and say, this is a child who's at risk for coming to kindergarten behind his or her peers, because the brain has set itself for an environment in which it is expecting either neglect or some other type of trauma. And that impairs learning and memory. So when we look at our achievement gap between children who are coming to our schools, between those that are what we call higher socioeconomic status or those lower socioeconomic status, in this chart here, the authors are looking at parental education as just one of those measures. And they divide the children into the two groups, those that have parents with higher education levels, those with lower education levels, and there's correlations that go along with that too. Those parents with higher education levels tend to have higher income as well. Those with lower education tend to have lower income. And we see that right from the very beginning, there are differences between children who are coming from these two groups, and it tends to widen a bit while they're in school. And the researchers have been able to explore differences much earlier. Hart and Risley, back in the 1990s, spent time videoing and taking audio recordings of interactions between parents and children in households with different backgrounds. So in this chart here, just comparing those families that have parents with college education relative to children who are growing up with very low income. And by the age of 3, children who have college-educated parents have twice the vocabulary as children who are growing up in poverty. And researchers are able to detect the difference between these two children as early as 18 months. So that's a sobering bit of information from neuroscience and developmental psychology. Just a final piece of research is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And from what I understand is that this study has been replicated in Wisconsin. There's information, so I'm looking for heads nodding. Is there an ACEs study here for Wisconsin? I understand at least there's information about this local area. So what is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Originally, this was conducted by Kaiser Permanente Health System in Southern California, and the health system was interested in learning about the conditions that their patients are coming to them with their health issues. And they surveyed them about their early childhood experiences, and they had 10 categories of adversity in the categories of abuse and neglect and also household dysfunction. And they simply looked at the correlations between the number of categories that these adults fell into in terms of the number of types of adverse experiences they had relative to their health outcomes. And this chart shows that once an adult has more than 6 of these early adverse experiences, that adult is 3 times more likely to be suffering from heart disease. And they see the same correlations between early adversity and adult outcomes in mental health issues such as depression, also chemical abuse and substance abuse. And what neuroscientists have been able to show is that when that early brain suffers early trauma, that it tends to be more prone to addiction and relative to a child that did not have this early adversity. So we step back from all of this information, and then we ask, well, what can happen? What type of interventions, what type of support can come in early in a child's life that could potentially make a difference and help to ameliorate some of this early adversity? So one of the most widely cited studies of an early program is the Perry-Preschool program. And how many of you have heard of the Perry-Preschool? So this is an important study to share a bit about. Originally, this study conducted in the 1960s. This is Ypsilanti, Michigan, just outside of Detroit, socioeconomically depressed area during the 1960s. And the special education director of that school system was interested to find out whether providing preschool early on would reduce the need for special education in the school system. So children in the Perry Project received 2 years of preschool. It was a half-day program, but the teachers visited the homes of those children to reinforce the lessons learned in that classroom environment, in the home environment. And the teachers were well-trained, and they were also compensated at the same levels as teachers in the school district. So there was very low turnover among staff. And then the researchers had to follow these children, both those that were randomly selected to be in the Perry Preschool program and those in the control group over time. So what did the researchers find? First, educational effects. They found there were a number of differences here. They found that achievement scores were higher for the children who attended Perry. The graduation rate was higher, a 65% graduation rate compared with 45%. Of course, we want that 65% to be higher, but it's a notable difference between these two groups of children. And indeed, the incidence of special education was reduced. And then at the age of 40, they found a number of differences. Home ownership rates were higher, earnings in the workforce were higher as well. And coming from the Federal Reserve, I needed to include this statistic. They're more likely to have a savings account at a bank. But most of the benefits to the Perry Project came from reductions in crime. So all crime rates, from felonies to misdemeanors, were essentially cut in half. So now we bring in the economists, and we ask them to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. So on an annual basis, this program costs about $12,000 per year per child in today's dollars. On average, the children attended for over a year and a half. So there we have the cost side. Then we see first their savings to the K through 12 system due to reductions in special education. Then we add up higher participant earnings. Now, most of this is a private benefit going to the children once they reach their working age, but some comes back to the public in the form of higher tax revenue. And then we see the cost savings due to reduced crime. So crime rates were reduced, so we have less need for police protection, court costs, and incarceration costs, and then reduced costs to the victims of crime. So adding up all of the benefits relative to costs, it's a very high ratio of benefits, $16 returned for every dollar invested. At the Federal Reserve, Art Rolnick, at the time our Director of Research, and I calculated what's called an annual rate of return. What is the internal rate of return? On an annual basis over the lifetime of these benefits. So that's going from age 5 up to the early 60s. And we estimate that total annual rate of return at 18%. Most of the benefit is accruing to the non-participants, to the public. So we estimate that public return at 16%. A Nobel laureate economist at the University of Chicago, James Heckman, has reanalyzed the entire study. It makes a more conservative assumption about how to monetize the crime benefits, but still has a very sizable annual rate of return, up to 10%. So all these rates are adjusted for inflation. Once you compare them to the long-run return in the stock market has been returning about 6% once you adjust for inflation. So this study is joined by 3 others that also have a high-quality research design and ask this question: what difference can be made in children who come from more of a disadvantaged background? So the Abecedarian Educational Child Care Project was studied in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill area. And in this study, children were randomly assigned to attend a program that starts as early as just a few months of age, moving up to kindergarten age, that included parent education and supports there with that program. They found that the children were less likely to need special education, their grade retention rates were lower, 3 times more likely to go on to college, and were less likely to be smoking at age 21, and that was used as a health benefit. So there they found benefits of $4 return for every dollar invested. More recently, they've tracked the children up to age in their mid-30s, and they found that they're less likely to have the conditions that would lead to heart disease and also diabetes. But they didn't put a cost framework, benefit framework around those benefits. Chicago Child Parent Center is a large-scale project in Chicago, a half-day program for children who are 3 and 4 years of age, also for low-income kids. The center also included parent education at the center. Here they found benefits that look quite similar to the Perry Preschool project. And then different from a center-based program where children go during the day, the original study for what's now known as the Nurse Family Partnership Home Visiting Program, which was studied in Elmira, New York, found that if you provide a registered nurse to counsel an at-risk expected mother starting at least by 27 weeks of pregnancy and counsel that mother through the birth process and until the age of 2 for the child, that there's a safer home environment for the kids. They found reductions in emergency room visits. They also found benefits for the mothers. The mothers were more likely to finish their education, attain and retain employment, also resulted in reduced social welfare costs, finding benefits of $5 for every dollar invested. So all of these ratios are over 1. So what does that mean? You're getting your money back. There's a return once that ratio is over 1. We can also calculate across these projects in terms of that annual rate of return. And we estimate the annual rates of return ranging from 7% up to as high as nearing 20%. And when we ask, well, who benefits the most from these investments? Well, certainly the children and their parents, their families are investing from these programs. The majority of benefits are accruing to the non-participants, to the public, to the taxpayer. So this means you don't even have to like children to achieve this high rate of return. You could be, Scrooge before his enlightenment in the Christmas Carol, and achieve this high rate of return. It just makes good business sense. So these are older studies, started many years ago. Of course, you need to have older studies in order to have long-term follow-up. There is more research that is coming out in more recent years that are showing indications of positive impact from investing early. One is just looking at state-funded preschool programs like you have here in Wisconsin with a 4K. But studies, I'm not including Wisconsin necessarily in this type of research design, but they have used a way to be able to compare children who are just a little bit too young to get into preschool and compare them with children who are just old enough to get into preschool for that year. So then you can make a good comparison over a year's time with those kids. And using that technique, they're able to show that kids are making positive gains in cognitive skills, but also on their social, emotional side. And I just note that research designs is important because it's not enough just to note that your children do better in your program in order to really be confident about the impact, because children might be on a developmental trajectory towards doing better as they get older, or there could be other factors such as what's happening in the household that could be helping with those improvements. So us researchers get very specific about how you develop those research designs. So we're very glad that we do have the randomized control trials with the peri-preschool program, Abecedarian, the Nurse-Family Partnership, because there we know the only difference between the two groups of kids is the flip of the coin, that the one group got into the program, the other didn't. Then we can be real confident about those results. A similar research design was provided for Head Start and early Head Start. And I want to just take some time here to talk about some of the research for Head Start. So Head Start is federally funded. It's provided to children who are ages 3 and 4 years of age, and provides that preschool experience, but also comprehensive services, looking at some healthcare issues, but also bringing parents, and there's really strong family involvement with Head Start. Originally started in the 1960s. So a randomized trial of Head Start back in the early 2000s was conducted, and critics of Head Start and those who are proponents of Head Start early on found that the conclusions were supporting that kids were definitely improving when they were in Head Start. However, by the end of first grade, they were finding that the kids who attended Head Start looked quite similar to the kids who were in the control group. So there has been discussion about, those of you who are coming into this room, you might have heard an argument about investing in early childhood, which is this. You invest in the kids early, and, well, yeah, they might look good early on, but by grade 3, it's all faded out. Those effects have gone away. Well, I've shown you already there's evidence from long-term studies that indeed those benefits do sustain. We have evidence that they sustain. In terms of the Head Start study, it was a high bar for this study. Children in the early 2000s, unlike the peri-preschool program, could go to other programs in the community. And many of them did, although they found that children who attended Head Start had a higher quality experience than those kids that went to other programs. And it also changed the federal government's approach to funding Head Start. They have been implementing quality improvements, such as the training of the teachers. They've also rebid some of the lower performing Head Start contracts so that there would be some competition for those contracts. But other research designs also point to long-term benefits from investing in Head Start. So, for example, researchers are able to take data sets of kids and watch them over time. And in research using these type of data sets, they find that there is some of this drop-off of effects and test scores early on, but then they see in the long run there's higher graduation rates, there are lower crime rates, there's some positive adult outcomes. So we may not be fully measuring with our early test scores the benefits of these early investments that seem to pop up later on. That is, these early investments are not only affecting cognitive skills, but they are affecting the social emotional side of the brain, and also what we call the executive function of the brain. That is the ability of a child and a person to self-regulate and to stay focused on tasks, to be motivated, and be persistent with tasks. And so the science of early childhood is really learning that these qualities are very important to have from these early programs. The third item that I show here is called the Infant Health and Development Program. And this program was inspired by the Abecedarian Project in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. They wanted to see if they could replicate that model and also provide services for a broader range of children that have the risk factor of low birth rate. And recently, a colleague at the University of Minnesota and also University of California have been able to analyze this data set looking at achievement gap reductions. And what they're able to do in the study is show that children who came in from low-income families and compared with those from higher-income families, by the age of 3, the achievement gap was gone. They were on developmental par. And going out as far as 18, that achievement gap was at least maintained. That is, it was cut in about half. And finally, a long-standing state preschool program in Michigan, which is targeted to children who are at risk, has found that those children who are in that program have better high school graduation rates. So this is some more contemporary research to put alongside our long-term studies. So the next piece I want to talk about is just the timing of these benefits. Now, some of these benefits you need to wait a while, wait for these children to get older, into their adolescent years, their early adult years, when you can get those crime reductions and those higher earning impact. But we do see benefits happening quite early, especially for home visiting programs, making home environments safer, reducing emergency room visits, also improving birth outcomes. In the Chicago Child Parent Study, they found there was a reduction in child abuse and neglect. And grade retention improvements and also reductions in special education, those benefits are accruing quite early. And finally, if you have a high-quality childcare system, that allows parents to enter the workforce, and when they're in the workforce and they're at the job, if their childcare arrangements are sound and they're of high quality, they're not worrying about them, and they're less likely to fall through the cracks. Cornell University has estimated that in a given year, up to about $3 billion is lost to companies because of childcare arrangements that are not working well. That is, parents, employees are absent from work, or they have to leave the job, or they're fired from the job, so there's higher turnover costs. And so the stronger childcare quality that we have, the better that supports local businesses and having parent employees in the workforce. So, and as you might know already, there's a high percentage of parents in Wisconsin with young children who are in the workforce. And what percentage might that be? Do you have a guess of what that might be? 50%? Higher than 50? Yeah. Okay. It is higher than 50. It's almost 75. So percent of children under 6 years of age with all of their parents, in the labor force is nearing 3/4 in Wisconsin. So children are somewhere else. They're not with their parents during that time. And so issues around childcare availability and quality become very important. So what are some of the key themes about investing in research, or from the research about investing in young children? What's consistent across the long-term studies, the more contemporary studies? And the first is the importance of investing in quality. So quality here refers to the qualifications of teachers, their ability to interact well with children, help them with their development, relatively low ratios of children to teachers in those center-based programs, and using a research-informed backed curriculum. The same is true for home visiting. Well-trained home visitors and are using research-backed methods. Involving parents is crucial. So all of these research studies, one thing that's consistent across them is the ability to connect with parents. So even childcare programs where a child might be attending for 40 hours a week or even more, are effective when that program and the professionals in that program are connecting with parents about child development milestones and what are the type of activities that are happening in that center. Starting early, so the continuum of investments are as early as prenatal, going up to kindergarten, that transition into kindergarten, and during the first few grades. I think a large discussion within the field is making sure that our system of early childhood is in understanding developmentally with early elementary grades, that we're having a developmental continuum that we can get kids to third grade reading proficiently, because once they hit that third grade, and if they're reading proficiently, that's a stronger predictor for whether they're going to graduate from high school and some of their future success. Reaching vulnerable children and families is where, from a public standpoint, we'll achieve the highest rate of return. This is where prevention dollars can be used early on, and prevention programs are going to be effective early on relative to if you wait. Remedial programs, once kids are older, are important to support, but we just recognize is that they're less effective and they are also more costly. And then finally, bringing this research to scale. Public programs for children who are from low-income families tend to be funded only to reach a portion of those children who are eligible. So Head Start tends to be funded to reach about 50 to 60% of eligible children. And this is for the bar for qualification is 100% of poverty or below, so about $24,000 per a family of 4 in a given year. And so there's a number of children who could benefit from these early investments. Wisconsin is doing well in terms of reaching 4-year-old children through 4K, but as you saw from the research, prenatal through 3 is very important for brain development. So for kids that have been facing adversity, when they come to 4K, that's an important program to help them. But for many, it would have been even better for them to have been reached early on. So these are some of the lessons learned from research. And then to talk a bit about the key investments, which we've been mentioning already. So starting early through home visiting is a strategy that's used here in this community, in this state. There's models similar to the Nurse-Family Partnership where you use a registered nurse, but also there are models that use a parent educator or someone more from the social work area. And these models show that if you reach families early, you're able to help stabilize families that are in a state of flux or adversity and facing challenges, and to help to support the environment for those young children. Preschool, as we mentioned, is an important intervention for young kids, and then quality childcare. So strategies to improve broadly the experience of children who are on childcare programs, whether that is in a licensed center program or in a licensed family-based program. So Wisconsin has the YoungStar childcare rating system, which provides information to parents about the quality of programs, help them understand relatively quickly about which programs have achieved a higher level of quality and which are on the pathway towards those higher ratings. And it helps parents show up at a childcare program and ask questions about the type of activities that their children will be in during the day. They want not just how much does it cost and what are the hours and where's the location. And that's on the demand side. It helps to make that market work more effectively. On the supply side, programs like YoungStar, quality rating systems that we see in other states as well, provide pathways for programs to move through that quality framework and to improve training and so on. Another aspect of quality that's important is business training. As you can imagine, leaders and directors of early childhood programs, there's probably a low percent that have an MBA. And these are all small businesses. And they're working in a market, and from research on that market and those businesses, the profit margins are very thin because it's a very labor-intensive job that you have to pay your staff for. So in terms of community involvement, there are efforts in our state and other states in terms of bringing together the business community to help support nonprofit childcare, family-based childcare programs so that they can get a leg up on some of the business aspect of running a childcare program. Parent education is important, whether that is a classroom-based education center or group-based parent education, or you're embedding that parent education into your home visiting programs. And then finally, high-quality healthcare, and so making sure that children are on our healthcare insurance rolls and that families are connected to medical home models that help support that continuity of care, and that parents are making their well child visits with their kids. And you can support a lot of development around those well child visits. So that's the type of continuum of investments to make in early childhood, and that they're made at the local, at the state, and the federal level. And so efforts that you have here underway are very important because so much can happen with local coordination and resources. Communities don't have to wait for policy and funding to necessarily change at the state and the federal. We're kind of working at all levels at the same time and providing good research and information about how to go forward. So I encourage your efforts here in this local community. And finally, I'm going to conclude my comments with this picture. So what is this a picture of?
This is the marshmallow test.
Exactly. So what is the marshmallow test?
You take me when I'm 6 and you sit me in front of the marshmallow and you tell me that if I can sit there and not eat the marshmallow for 5 minutes, that I'll get 3 marshmallows.
Yeah, that's about right. We'll give you 15 minutes and we'll only give you one more, but it's right on track. So in that setting where you have the child and the research offers the marshmallow and offers this, I'll give you 1 or 2 more later on. The researcher steps out. Of course, everyone is watching from behind one of those black mirrors to see what the child will do. And so some children reach out, eat the marshmallow, it's over. Other children develop strategies to keep themselves from looking at the marshmallow. They'll look around the room, they'll hum a song. They're developing some of that self-regulation. And replications of this study, so this was first studied in Stanford by Walter Mischel back in the 1960s. Replications of this study have shown associations towards children who waited, that they had better school performance, less likely to have obesity, and they have stronger adult outcomes as well. So I offer this picture of the marshmallow because investing in early childhood in many ways is a societal marshmallow test. That is, there's some pain, what is economics called? The phrase for economics? The dismal science. One aspect of that is, economists are always saying you have to make choices, right? So investing in early childhood does require more resources, whether you're reallocating in your public budgets to focusing into the early years, or you're raising taxes to raise more revenue to make these investments, or from a community and philanthropic side, we're spending more of our time, our philanthropic dollars, into these early investments. But the research shows that if we do make these investments, and don't grab for that marshmallow right away as the analogy, that 10, 15 years down the road, there will be many marshmallows available to us to roast on the fire, on that campfire. So with that, I'd be happy to open it up for questions and discussion.
Just a comment, Craig Grunewald, Superintendent of Schools. I certainly appreciate this coming from you as a researcher. We hear this in the educational world from educators all the time. So I certainly appreciate you being here today. In terms of return of investment, you touched on special education. That is certainly a component that we deal with in public schools, and I'm not sure, and maybe I missed it in terms of how we quantify the return on investment in general in education, because other than special education, we're spending a tremendous amount of increased resources on issues with students coming in, beginning in 4K. And the difference that we see, the entry of a student at 4K going into kindergarten across this community, across the state of Wisconsin, it's just the gaps between students is significant. So the dollars that we spend in public education outside of special education, because those dollars are quite high as well, we're seeing an increase in resources needed. So just emphasizing, I certainly understand and see the return on investment and the increased return that we'll see when we better prepare children coming into 4K education.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a comment about gains to education is, if you can reduce special education, it's an identified cost area. You can reduce grade retention. You're saving money there. One of the harder ones to measure, but as economists, we've been trying to find different ways to think about this, is what we call classroom productivity. Maybe a short phrase for the dynamic that you're describing. That is, children who come in behind tend to get some more attention from the teacher, more services from that school to help those children catch up to where they should be developmentally. So you are tapping that teacher's resources, the resources of the school, to help make up that difference. And we haven't to date, we haven't put the dollar amount on that activity, but it's not insignificant, is what I'm hearing.
Well, absolutely. And to put a dollar to it is very difficult, because when we have to take the attention of that specific teacher and gear it towards a smaller group of students, we're decreasing the time the attention of the larger group of students is getting from that particular staff member, which creates a whole different issue for us.
And as I mentioned from the Head Start randomized trial, where they found the kids who attended Head Start relative to the control group were doing better after attending Head Start and as they entered the school system, but at the end of first grade they looked similar to the other kids. But you look at the trajectories of both children who attended Head Start and those in the control group, they were both increasing in their scores. But it seemed that those that came in behind in the control group were catching up. And you can imagine that this dynamic is happening in schools, is that schools are giving some more resources to those kids to help them be able to catch up and make up that difference.
I guess I'll just add another layer to that. Meg Earler, I'm the president of the school board. And what we're seeing at a local level, and anecdotally my understanding is what we're seeing at the state level, is serious increase in mental health issues within our classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And so this concept of health care hopefully is expansive enough to begin to deal with some of those, because there are behavioral issues within classrooms or levels of understanding or learning, but there's also just the reality of kids that just, because of ACEs, because of trauma, because of whatever, are just, in critical condition. And we locally have seen a significant increase in that within the last 6, and in particular the last 2 years.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that forward, because it adds to this point about what schools have to do when kids come in with the mental health problems, because it's hard for these kids to keep their attention focused, to be able to take in information, to be able to work well with other kids, and so on. And there is a whole host of research now looking at the effects of early trauma, early adversity on that. And we also recognize that there's stressors that are happening for families these days, that some of them are relatively in the newer in terms of drug addiction, in terms of the impact of poverty. We also have a society that has a different way of how kids get to grow up. I mean, when I grew up near Madison and Watertown, Mom said what? Out the door. This is after my early childhood years. But kids got a lot more time outside, a lot more free play. There's now a culture more of an indoor environment, screen environment. And to be able to have those activities where families are out and being able to engage in community activities, but also outdoors is something. So there's some research that I'm looking at more around just what has happened in that dynamic in terms of physical movement and being able to be in the outdoors while growing up. Because there's what some occupational therapists are just noticing is that kids are just not able to regulate themselves, and that is something that has been changing over the last 10 to 15 years.
My name is Andrew Hoverson. I'm with Ellis Construction here locally, and I guess from an economist perspective, I'd be very interested in your points of view relating to child care from a macro level, relating to the financial impact of families from an annual income perspective. I think we've identified society's several steps that can be taken for those that would be definitely defined as lower income. I think we've written off those that obviously have an annual income high enough on the fact that the sheer cost is simply an annoyance. But I think the concern rests with those household incomes that are really between, say, $50,000 and $75,000 a year, where those families aren't eligible for obviously any of those subsidies that the state or federal government offers. Those that make more income than that, I don't think we necessarily need to be concerned. That would probably relate to lifestyle choices that need to be prioritized. But from an economist perspective, how do we start to help that income range of families in a county like ours, where statistically we have one of the highest, if not the highest, dual income earning households in the United States? How do we either at a macro level start to address those financial challenges, or through some of the initiatives that we may be able to continue to advance here, how do we start to stem that $1,200 to $1,500 a month burden in some cases for those families? That is a serious concern. What's your perspective on that in general, in connection to making sure those quality support structures are in place for you?
Yeah, it's a
Section 125s. I mean, is it tax deductions? I mean, what else is available from your point of view at a high level to start to stem that concern?
It's a very good point because certainly the research I showed and the policy perspective I was painting here is really focused on where the children who would benefit the most, and we haven't reached them all, and there's still work to be done here, and that's where we get the highest return. But certainly once we get above where we set those cliff markers for when children and families would qualify for programs, is that you have these gaps. So anytime you have a drop and you put a marker down in terms of what is low income, you start to look beyond that and you see that there is a cohort here who could benefit from some additional support. And I think you've dollar relatively hit it well. It's about that $50,000 to $75,000 range where childcare costs become still a very large component of a family's expenses. And it's also at a time when families tend to be in their early years of earning income. So these are young parents. They're earlier in their careers. Their income is not as high as it's going to be 10 years down the road when they're more established in their careers. So we're asking families to take on a financial burden it's just a tough time for them to be doing this. So I think there are strategies in the tax code. I mean, there is access now to the developmental or to the child care child care tax benefit, tax credit, so that families can be able to access some of that, but that's only a portion of what their costs would be. So it's a strategy around expanding what that might look like so that they could use the tax code as a way to help buffer the costs of childcare. And another approach is to be able to look at our systems of support in the subsidy realm and be able to create gradations going forward. One of the strategies we have in Minnesota for funding programs for preschool children who are lower income, but also children who are earlier years that have adverse experiences and higher risks, is just to provide scholarships, like in higher education. So in higher education, you provide scholarships to kids who need help and families that need help to pay for college. And so a strategy in Minnesota is that we provide these scholarships early. and provide them to families that have lower income, and that scholarship is good for a high-quality program of their choice. And what you can do with a strategy like that is then start, just as in higher education, you do a partial financial aid as your income goes higher. So your financial support, gets lower as your income is higher. Just how, families these days have to report what their income is to be able to look at what their college support would look like. So basically your strategy of using the tax code or finding ways to build in some partial subsidy to those families can be an important strategy. And I think, from a business leader perspective too, businesses are understanding from their HR strategy that families are looking for flexibility and support with their work-life balance. And so a number of companies are looking at how to support childcare choices in their communities and help support some of the cost, even direct cost, or providing on-site childcare if possible for larger businesses. And so that becomes a strategy for businesses for their own recruitment efforts and retainment efforts. But there's also a community benefit for that activity too, because it's benefiting not only the family and the child, but those to the business. Those benefits are spreading out. You're more likely to have kids coming to school better prepared and better prepared to succeed. So we want to think about, as you look at community strategies around how to support childcare, having the business community at the table, thinking about how, as a collective community, you want to let families know and prospective employers. If you're looking at our community here in Stevens Point, this is a child-friendly community. That can be a community recruitment to bringing families into a local area, because we do really well for families and childcare.
Yeah. On your key investment slide, you have 5 things: home visiting, preschool, quality child care, parent education, and healthcare. And is there a benefit return difference between that? Like, I just think of, to me, home visiting sounds like much more expensive, much higher touch versus, say, some of the others. Did you guys differentiate or look at just one of those or 2 of those versus a lot of them?
Yeah. The evidence from home visiting and the cost structure. So the cost structure for a home visiting program using, let's say, the nurse-family partnership model on an annual basis is $5,000, $6,000 per year. Now, and that's going to range depending on what community you're in. Some communities are just going to have higher cost structures than others. So you might think about $4,500 up to $6,000. Healthy Families America is another social service professional-oriented model that has somewhat similar cost structures. Now, those models are more expensive early, and their visits are less frequent once children get older. So let's say when the children gets to over the age of 1, or in the Healthy Families model, over the age of 2, they'll become less expensive. So actually, the home visiting models are relative to full year, full day, early learning center models are less expensive than providing that full-time care during a given year. In child care in metro areas, it can be well over $10,000, $12,000 for an infant or toddler. Smaller communities, you'll see some of those costs being a bit lower. But it is getting in the realm of university tuition is what we often talk about. So in terms of what the rates of return, most of the study has been for children who are at risk, who are from low income and so on. And the primary evidence is coming from home visiting and what you would call early learning. So if you take childcare and preschool and kind of wrap them around and just call this high quality early learning environments, you're seeing solid rates of return. If you had a given dollar of which one to spend, one or the other, if you had to deal with that trade-off, you'd probably look a bit more at what your population is, what your resources are. But they're both good investments and important to have that continuity. If you built a really strong home visiting sector, but you didn't have a good handoff to a high quality early learning center, at least by preschool years, then you're at risk for reducing some of that benefit by the time you get to kindergarten. So what my answer from the research is, it's the cost-benefit research is not so precise as to, say here definitively home visiting versus early learning versus so on is where you're going to get the highest return. I'd say the way to read this evidence is that returns are strong in these programs when there are certain qualities that are present. And that is, you have well-trained staff, you're using research-backed methods, you're replicating the type of environments that were used in these research programs, then you're going to expect to get a pretty strong rate of return.
So our company at one time provided on-site daycare for preschool kids, and we're no longer doing that. But the question that I have is, can the federal government, can you help encourage and emphasize our country into giving some kind of tax breaks to corporations and companies that provide subsidized daycare for kids?
Mm-hmm. It's a great point.
I mean, from the research that you're showing, there's definitely a benefit to the society in general, not to that company, other than keeping those employees and improving turnover.
So there have been tax codes. So first of all, the Federal Reserve is not a federal agency. We're a bank that's separate from the federal government. So it's a nuance, but an important nuance. So the Federal Reserve sits outside of government, but we're accountable to government. We have to, our chair, Janet Yellen, has to report to Congress about what the Federal Reserve is doing in terms of its mandates and its goals and so on. And as some of you may be aware, there are those in office who are looking at how to make changes to the Federal Reserve. And some changes were made during the Dodd-Frank Act. But aside from that, I think the point that you're making is very good. It's like, how can incentives be put in place to encourage companies to make these investments, whether that's their own on-site childcare, whether it's making an investment in the community, and being able to promote those investments. So some strategies by some states, and it's a handful of states now have this on their books. It's to provide at least a 50-cent credit to a company, some are more, some are less, and tax benefit for any type of investment like this that the company can show. And so that would be a strategy to consider. The tax code in Louisiana is very nuanced around childcare. It has a way of being able to provide tax benefit to businesses that make these type of investments, but they also use the tax code to make benefits to programs that are improving their quality, and they're also using the tax code to help support lower-income families that have their children in higher quality. So I can certainly point out to where some of those states are that are doing this. It's not the tax code for businesses to help encourage and make these investments is an important one. They see that it's effective, it's useful. On the margin of what is needed in terms of total dollar value, it is still a marginal benefit, but still an important one.
You had talked about there would be some bidding for Head Start programs to increase some accountability and effectiveness and so forth. Where have you seen successful programs, whether it's Head Start or other programs, and how have you seen them measure effectiveness without stifling, burdening the organization so much that it actually decreases their effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. Head Start as a system has standards, and they've been working to improve with those standards the quality of the teachers, let's say. But there still is variation in quality in the Head Start system. I think one of the findings from the study is that they could go back in and try to sort through what are those aspects of a Head Start center that shows higher quality and so on. You see a similar attempt in child care rating systems to be able to show here is a higher rated program, these are the qualities, this is what you have to get to in order to show that you're producing that quality. In Minnesota, our quality rating system is called Parent Aware, and through research they've been able to show that indeed there are differences in child outcomes between those children who are attended higher rated programs 3 or 4 star in our 4-star rated system versus children who are in programs that are on that pathway towards higher rating at the 1 and 2 star. So they first want to see, to the extent of quality, does quality make a difference for kids? But I think this point about what is the impact on programs is very important, because as you would imagine, a system that is moving towards quality, some parts of that programs appreciate, they like the mission, professionalize the program and so on, but it's also more work. And so it is a balance. And I think in Minnesota, I imagine you have this too with Youngstar here, is that they really you need to balance the onerousness of the additional requirement versus what the programs can really translate into positive child outcomes. So in terms of child care rating systems, a strategy has been often in states is to make sure that there's good relationship between your child care support in the quality rating system and those programs. But still, you're gonna run into this trade-off in terms of where that is. I think where some of the largest challenges in the field are as you professionalize your workforce and you start to give credentials to professionals who can use those credentials elsewhere, outside of early learning. So if you have a BA teacher who's your lead teacher in your early learning center and an opening comes available at a kindergarten classroom in the school system, odds are that kindergarten job is going to be paying more, and then there's certainly an incentive to move there. So I think one of the key issues that we need to think about as we are improving standards for quality is how to make sure that we are supporting the funding of these programs so that you can retain talent in your program. If that's through compensation, if it's through the work environment, however that is that we structure our incentives to do so. One of the learnings in Minnesota in developing the scholarship system is that our pilot project, we were able to use investments from private business people to fund that. So we were able to put out there a dollar amount that was high enough for programs that was above market rate for what they were typically charging families, and really give them support to provide a high quality experience. And we found that that was an incentive for new providers to move into the area, for providers to get higher quality, and then you can use those dollars to support and retain your staff. So I think as a society, as we understand what the benefits are from these investments, that's where we need to make sure that we keep our workforce, our talented workforce, in early learning, and not just coming to support the great work the schools do.
Has there been any research done on outcome of children in the U.S. versus other countries that offer more or longer paid maternity and paternity leave? Does that have a huge income on those children when they're going into school? They got a year with a parent at home versus a few weeks or a month or two?
Yeah, it's certainly, one of the issues I did not bring up in this presentation is parental leave. And compared with investments in families in a number of developed countries, the United States lags in pretty much all areas. So developmentally, the science would say that if we can have a policy where parents are able to be at home with their new infant and be able to support that development of that infant and be supportive, that would be good for brain science, that's good for child development. And our country just does not have that support. You do see that support in a lot of other developed countries. You also see, and this is primarily Europe, but Europe also supports a lot of the quality childcare type settings and also preschool. I mean, preschool funding is a lot more robust, and also supports for what happens in those childcare arrangements are a lot more robust as well. So as compared with other countries, the United States is very much lagging behind. A question is, how does the United States, how do states like Wisconsin move forward with the system that we have. And our system is very market-based, and so we have to understand how can we bring parental leave policy in and keep our businesses competitive, and that's certainly a tension that we hear across the board. But you also see businesses in their HR strategy, some are moving towards better parental leave policy in order to attract employees. Also, while you see a lot more support in European countries where they're providing free universal preschool for children ages 3 and 4 through their school system, our system is much more diverse in terms of what's offered. We have a lot of different choices for parents. There can be benefits to having lots of different choices in hours and settings, in family-based program, childcare, also supported by schools and Head Start. And how can we leverage that entire availability so that we have high-quality choices? So maybe we're not going to the European model, but how can we take our current system of supports and be able to improve quality and access to it? But I think parental leave is an important discussion. It's just not part of this presentation. Can only bite off so much.
Rob, I'm with United Way, and part of the Born Learning Initiative, the initial phase of this, is to build on our existing home visitation model. So we are now working with a number of organizations, including Portage County Health and Human Services and the United Way, to pool resources so that we can enhance our existing home visitation and more than double those families that will be reached. We've worked very hard to identify a model, families, a curriculum that is evidence-based and evidence-informed, and believe we can get those programs off and running by the 1st of February of next year. So we as a community are investing and will invest heavily in home visitation. And to Andrew's question about serving families that fall outside of that poverty guideline, families will be a part of that program based on risk factors, not based on income. And therefore, we get to the families with the highest need. So there'll be more to come on that work.
Mm-hmm. And it's great work that you're doing there. I think also being able to treat I saw in your model, the triage and coordinate across models is really important, because while we understand these different models have developed with different emphasis in home visiting, and being able to understand family conditions relative to what model best meets the needs of those families, but also having just your home visiting a community interacting at some level and being able to provide some common standards or shared professional development can be a big bonus. The scholarship pilot that I mentioned in Minnesota was combined with parent mentoring as a model. And so in St. Paul, we brought together home visitors to help support the scholarship model. And it was really the first time they came together and got to, oh, you're doing this, and you're just like natural coordination was starting to happen.
You noted the very clearly thin margins for people who are operating childcare. I mean, especially individual providers. And the charts talk about how early in life we really need to have that quality interaction with kids. We as a community see a real dearth of infant childcare and waiting lists. And it's at a time when clearly the families are the most stressed in terms of how they're making their arrangements. And I guess I'm wondering if you can speak to that and whether you're aware of any states or local communities that have put that focus in on infant childcare to try to grow opportunities for families.
Yeah, because it's real important around infant care that often the child care model is a business model, is that your infant side is expensive because you have that low ratio of infants to teachers. So the program may be losing money on this side, but they know the family's going to stay in, so then your cost structure works out, so by the time they reach toddlers, you're making a thin margin. In preschooler age, you might be making a bit more. And so as a business model, you're just constrained on that early expense. And so I'm in terms of strategies, particular to infant child care, I haven't heard a community just focusing, just on that. I think all of the strategies I've mentioned so far in terms of trying to improve quality, the business side of childcare is one way to help potentially support these small businesses to be able to support those classrooms because they can structure their business plans in a way that will help to open that a bit more. But a community may also make a decision that we're going to step in and focus on infant and toddlers and notice where can we leverage some building space support, or where can we put our own dollars in so we get more of those openings. I think we have a lot of informal childcare happening in these early years, and so the extent that there is more licensed formal childcare available, that's a positive. But we need to also remember that as we work with home visiting models, too, is how do these home visiting models, parent education models can reach family, friend, and neighbor providers so that they're getting information about how to provide that informal setting as high quality as possible. Yeah. Anything further? Okay, well, thanks for the discussion. It's great to be here, and best wishes with your work in the community. Sounds great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time today. I think this was really a great presentation, tremendously informative. Along with that, as a part of the follow-up, as a takeaway, we are going to be sending out copies of his slides so you have a little bit more detail on the research if you want to look at that closer and share it with your friends, because I know it's awesome. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.